Welcome back, everyone. This is our final session on DAO hacks and ways to avoid them. Our moderator for this session is Dr. Dan Bonet, professor of computer science at Stanford University, where he heads the Applied Cryptography Group and co-directs the Stanford Center for Blockchain Research. Hi, Dan. Hi, everyone. I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Christine. This is great. I mean, this is the last session of our DAO Symposium. I think it's one of the more exciting sessions on how to secure DAOs and the various hacks that have happened in the world of DAOs. So welcome everyone to this fantastic session. We have three wonderful panelists. I'll introduce them in just a second, but just as background, I want to remind everyone that sort of the number of hacks that have happened in the world of blockchains and DAOs in particular, just in 2021, just in last year in 2021 has gone up quite significantly. As reported, of over $3 billion have been stolen from various blockchain projects. I guess we'll dive into this in just a few seconds. So to discuss that and to discuss what to do about it and how to secure a blockchain project and where things are going, we have three fantastic panelists. So actually, why don't we go around and have the three of you quickly introduce yourselves. Jesse, let's start with you. So maybe just a few sentences about your background.
Sure thing. Hi, everyone. I'm currently the Chief Compliance Officer and Regulatory Counsel at Ribbit Capital, which is a venture capital firm just right by Stanford. We invest in fintech and crypto and deep in Web3 right now. I'm doing a lot of sort of deep dive into the DAO space with respect to a VC. Before that, though, I worked for about a decade in the Department of Justice prosecuting a variety of crimes, but most recently those that touch crypto, which range from the terrorism financing cases and the recent Bitfinex hack. So I've seen both sides of the space.
Perfect. Yeah, thank you for joining us. And Ari, let's continue with you. Just a few words.
Terrific. Absolutely. My name is Ari Redboard. I'm head of legal and government affairs at TRM Labs. We are a blockchain intelligence company. So we work with law enforcement and regulators really as a tracing tool to build investigations in crypto. We also work with financial institutions and crypto businesses and DeFi protocols as a compliance tool to monitor transactions and to assure that illicit activity is not flowing through. My real claim to fame is that I was able to work with Jesse Brooks at the U.S. Attorney's Office for many years, also prosecuting cases in the national security space. I then spent a couple years at the U.S. Treasury Department, again working on these types of issues. So like Jesse, I've seen it from both sides, but really excited for this conversation today. I think there's been a lot of conversation sort of around illicit finance and hacks in crypto, but I don't know if that many have sort of focused on the DeFi space in particular.
Perfect. Yeah, and we're going to dive into that in just a second. That's great. So welcome, Ari. Thank you for joining us. And let's continue with Dan. Dan Guido, you want to say a few words about yourself?
Hey there, folks. I am in a cab, so apologies for not having my video on at the moment. But I'm the CEO and co-founder of Trail of Bits. We're a software security research and development firm that works with a lot of software developers to write secure software. So for a lot of the people that are suffering the most for these sort of hacks that have been happening, we're one of the firms that helps prevent them from occurring. And we have a lot of kind of research that we apply in doing so, and a lot of history and knowledge and kind of information about how they occur. So thanks. I'm going to go find a seat now.
Great. Yeah, thank you, Dan, for joining us from the cab. Let's see. So we have, you guys basically have a lot of visibility to what's happening in the space, both through Ribbit, from TRM, from Trail of Bits, so the kind of key players in the space. Before we get started, I just wanted to do a quick survey of kind of the, some of the hits that have happened. I don't want to say greatest hits, but some of the hacks that have happened recently. I guess in March 2022, probably all of you have heard there was a big attack on the Ronin network. In particular, the Ronin bridge was attacked, and $600 million were stolen from one side of the bridge. This was basically an attack that compromised the M of N style signature scheme that the bridge used, and the attackers were able to walk away with, or at least transfer $600 million into their own Ethereum address. And Ari can tell us actually more about what happened, where those funds went after. So we'll get to that in just a minute. Beanstalk in April, it's a hack where $180 million were stolen. This was a very interesting one because that was a governance attack where the attacker was actually able to pass a governance resolution to pay themselves basically the funds from the treasury, and basically again the funds were transferred to the attacker's account. So kind of an interesting attack on governance. Again, there was a particular mistake that was done in the governance protocol in that particular example that we'll get into in just a minute. And the list goes on and on and on. I have actually a long list that I'm not going to go over. And of course, this goes all the way back to 2016 with the original DAO hack, where something like $50 million were stolen, and that caused a big issue for the Ethereum network. So these things happen a lot. They happen, unfortunately, too often. And so let's first of all dive into understanding why these things happen and actually what are their impacts. So Dan Guido, let's start with you. Maybe you can talk a little bit about the causes of why is it that there are so many hacks and so many vulnerabilities in this space?
Yeah, sure. I'd love to. I found a seat. I'm getting closer to a desk. So I think that what we see from a technology perspective is that there are security haves and have-nots. There's a bimodal distribution of security expertise among people that are building blockchain software. So we have a lot of people that are not applying best practices when they develop software. They don't realize the threat that they're under, and they're developing it in a lot of the ways that someone would develop a web application, where you believe that you can fix it in production, that issues are survivable. What you're trying to do is mitigate consequences. That's not exactly possible on blockchain software. Instead, we see that there are security haves that have figured out that this is high assurance software. It's the same kind of software you need to write when you are launching a rocket into space. You only get one chance. And if you screw up, it blows up. And that's kind of a hard corner to turn for a lot of people that are operating in the blockchain space. But the best performing teams do things like specification development, property development. They understand the software that they are building, and then they test against that. That process has been robustly applied for many people that are carrying billions of dollars that you will never hear about getting hacked because they do a great job. And yes, I do know there's some background noise. I'm going to move locations right after this, but I think that sort of sets the stage.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah, thank you. So really this sort of pressure to launch, not everybody's doing proper reviews of the code. I think the analogy to a rocket is really good. I mean, you got to get it right on the first try, otherwise you're going to lose a lot of the treasury.
Dan, I'll jump in just real quick on this sort of level setting a little bit. Look, I mean, in the age of the internet, a hack meant the loss of usernames and passwords, PII. But what's so extraordinary sort of in this age of crypto, a hack could mean, it's bank robbery at the speed of the internet, essentially. You're stealing funds that are then ultimately, if you can off-ramp them, usable in the real world at the speed of the internet. And, that could mean essentially the loss of life savings, the loss of a small business, the end of an exchange, we're talking about DeFi projects. A lot of these are not large, and these could be, have a real impact. So I think it's just level setting a little bit. This is not what crypto has allowed for, this sort of permissionless, decentralized, cross-border value transfer, sort of all the power and promise of it, also leaves it in some respects vulnerable to this ability to sort of, hack exchanges, which are essentially, which is for essentially bank robbery. And, you mentioned the Ronin hack. Look, I mean, that has been now connected by Treasury and law enforcement as Lazarus Group, which is North Korea's state-sponsored hacking group. And really what that says is that, I mean, North Korea for years has professionalized these attacks on crypto businesses, but now, I mean, they're doing $600 million hacks in the space. And this is not just funds that are being used, for, to spend or try to off ramp. These are funds that are being used for destabilizing activity and weapons proliferation. So the stakes are very, very high and feel like they're becoming more and more high. But I sort of want to mention this idea, before you just couldn't steal money on the internet. And I think crypto sort of allows for that in more meaningful ways. And that's really, I think, what is driving a lot of this, this activity.
That's great. Actually, Ari, I want to continue with you in that. So we see the hacks happening. Basically, the funds move from where they're supposed to be to the attacker's account, be it a nation state or being an individual. So with a TRM, you have a lot of visibility as to what happens after the hack actually occurred. So can you walk us a little bit through what happens once an attacker obtains those funds? How does he ramp them? How does he launder them?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. I'll kick it off. And I know that Jesse has a lot of expertise in this space too. So what we essentially see at TRM is we take that raw blockchain data, the to, the from, the amounts, the addresses, and we layer it with threat intelligence. So if we see an address that is associated, for example, with the Ronin hack, we label it, hacked or stolen funds within our tool. And then sort of when that address is surfaced, the user of the tool will understand sort of, oh, this is an address that is now associated with the Ronin hack. So for example, really a week or so ago, when we saw Treasury put that alphanumeric crypto address as a part of a designation, a sanctions designation of Lazarus Group, I took that address, I put it in TRM and basically fell out of my seat because what it told me was that Treasury had now designated an address connecting Lazarus Group to the Ronin hack. But then from there, essentially, you're watching the funds move. So for example, the Bitfinex case, which Jesse played, a significant role in, what we're able to see is those funds essentially leave the exchange, sit in a wallet address that we then associated with the hack, right? And then you essentially watch them stay there for a while, but then you watch them move around over about 5 or 6 years through a series of obfuscation techniques. And, law enforcement are using these types of tools to follow the funds. And just one sort of putting a point on this, that's the extraordinary thing about crypto, right? Is that while you can move money faster and in larger amounts than ever before, which makes it very attractive to illicit actors, law enforcement and investigators also have more visibility on those financial flows than they've ever had before, which allows a lot more of this tracing and tracking using these types of blockchain analytics tools.
Because everything is recorded on a blockchain and they can see it and they can see it. But all right, I want to stay with you I want to stay with you for just one more second. In that, in some of the recent attacks that we've seen, for example, in the Beanstalk attack, $180 million were stolen. The account, of course, immediately gets blacklisted, so they can't just move to an off-ramp and extract the funds. But what we saw is that like $80 million were then moved into Tornado Cash, which is an anonymizing mixer. And now it becomes much harder to trace where the funds are going to. So what do you do in that case?
Yeah, look, I think that there are all kinds of ways that illicit actors try to obfuscate the flow of funds on blockchains. They use anonymity enhanced coins like Monero. They use mixing services, as you mentioned, like Tornado Cash. They use darknet markets, even automating transactions. There's so many different things. There's no question that these mixing services on blockchains, obfuscate the transactions and make it more difficult for investigators to follow funds, but they are not dead ends. If you look at the Bitfinex case, for example, or if you look at Ronin or really any number of other cases, the fact is law enforcement still was able to trace and in some cases seize back the funds. So there are certainly ways that one can continue sort of tracing with these types of tools. And a lot of it comes down to, I know Jesse will agree with this one, and that is, these tools are very powerful and it's extraordinary. They're extraordinary for investigations. But at the end of the day, every one of these cases comes down to great police work. There's always some break where an agent sort of goes to an exchange or goes to another protocol or platform and asks for information that sort of cracks the case. So the tools are very powerful. Oftentimes sort of mixers are not necessarily a dead end. And there's lots of things that can be done there.
Yeah. So the tracing tools are very powerful, and they do give law enforcement quite a lot of information to work with. It's interesting. It's going to be interesting to see how this plays out in the long term. So Jesse, I want to turn to you actually and talk a little bit about the consequences of these hacks. So who's liable? Who's actually losing funds here? Who compensates the victims? Can you walk us through that a bit?
Certainly. I think about these issues a lot, but I first just want to start with the human side of it. I mean, Ari touched on it, but in this race that we're all in to accomplish speed over security, it's easy to forget that real people are being affected by these hacks and losing life-changing money without recourse. There are just endless stories about people trying to figure out who to call to get an answer. And we see headline after headline. We've all sort of talked about it here, even over the course of the past few days. And regulators are seeing the same headlines. And this is really only going to speed up regulator intervention in light of the deficient consumer protection here. To give some platforms credit, they're frequently trying to compensate victims of the hack and trying to figure out a way to get money back, but that's just not going to be possible as time goes on. So that's the human side, but there's also sort of the liabilities question. So what are we supposed to do now, right? And who's responsible and who should we hold responsible? And everyone here knows that when people lose money, lawsuits inevitably are going to result, not to mention enforcement action from regulators, but who are going to be the named parties. And I know that a few panels here have discussed sort of the legal structures of DAOs, and that they default to the general partnership structure. So essentially each partner is going to have joint and several liability. But what does that mean in practice? I mean, I, as a lawyer at a VC firm, have to spend a lot of time trying to explain, like, what do these words mean for you and how should we be thinking about them? So if like a governance platform X, we won't have to use any name, is hacked, is each owner that holds token X liable because they're technically an owner? And that's the beautiful thing about a DAO, but it also creates complicated legal issues. And so how can large token holders protect themselves from being these named parties? I mean, we see the recent Uniswap litigation, which isn't quite based on this, but interestingly, that VCs are being named in that lawsuit. So how do we think as a large token holder, or even as a medium-sized token holder, how are you going to be protected when a hack does happen? And what if a hack results from a governance vote? So what if there's a vote that says, hey, should we change the code in XYZ way? And you vote yes, and you have some of those tokens. Are you more liable? Is this going to discourage voting, which would take away from, the very purpose of a lot of these governance DAOs? So there are endless questions here. And we talk about wrapping DAOs as being a solution, and it is on some of the liability, but it doesn't solve everything. And I think more and more regulators are in the space are going to be getting involved here. And the good thing is that they'll be able to solve some of these problems. I think we just have to push back on ensuring that they don't go over the top and trying to solve every problem in a way that stifles these amazing new creations.
Can you just maybe walk us through what happened in a couple of the recent hacks? Like, who actually lost money as a result? If the DAOs themselves were trying to compensate the victims, so who actually ended up losing money?
So they all have acted very, very differently. And I feel like each actor in this space is sort of taking it on itself to decide what to do. And I could walk through each one, but essentially what a lot of them have been is the treasury is hacked. And so the money is pulled from the treasury, but who does that really belong to? If we're thinking about a DAO, it's all the token holders, right? And so the token price also is going to plummet. So who does that affect? Now, it's going to affect VCs that invested, it's going to affect the big token holders, but it's also going to invest the individual who said, I put $100 into buying this token, and I believed that it was either a stable, no, it's not a stable coin, but a stable token, or that I was putting my money in there in order to be able to make money, or I was putting it in there in order to be able to take out a loan somewhere else. So we put a lot of faith into these treasuries without sort of understanding that there's a lot of risk associated with it. So what we've been seeing is that some of these bigger protocols have made so much money already, and some of these treasuries have hundreds of millions of dollars in it, that they'll say, okay, well, we can do something to pay back into the space. We can pay back to the people that lost money, or a portion of it. So we're beginning to see that kind of solution happen, but there is no way that is going to be able to continue. Like right now, there's so much money in the space, but as Dan said, like the ones that are doing it right, they're not going to have to think about this. And the ones that are doing it wrong are frequently going to be the ones that don't have a backstop of funds to be able to help those that are part of their community.
Yeah, that's a very complete answer. Thanks. Great. So now we kind of understand what happens like when a hack actually occurs. I want to kind of talk a little bit about how does this look like from the DAO's point of view. So let's say you're part of a DAO, the DAO gets hacked. The question is what to do next. So presumably law enforcement gets involved. And I guess it depends on, it's not exactly clear even which law enforcement needs to get involved, right? Which country, which jurisdiction. But can the three of you maybe talk a little bit about what's the, like from your experience, what is the best way to interact with law enforcement? Or maybe even talk about what is the role of law enforcement in this space?
I'll sort of start as a general level and then people can sort of trickle in. There's a lot to say here. The short answer is law enforcement can help. And as Ari touched on, and anyone who remotely understands the power of blockchain analytic tools can understand that sort of stealing is a bit the easy part because laundering is much more difficult to hide. And the Bitfinex case is one where you see like these complex techniques being used. But law enforcement is not, even if we're just talking about the US law enforcement, even if we're talking about the FBI or IRS or HSI, like they can't do every case. Like there are individuals who lose money on Coinbase all the time. Like the FBI can't come in and open a big investigation into every single case that happens for every single individual. So we can't rely on them too much. But then on top of it, let's say if you're a DAO and you get hacked for a big amount, as you said, Dan, like which law enforcement do you go to? Who has jurisdiction? Also, who's the party, right? Who is the party that's being represented? And as lawyers in the space, this is something that we struggle with, but it also works here too. Who is the victim? Is it every single individual who holds a token? And if so, there are victims' rights that attach to each of these individuals when you go into litigation. How do you think about that? And who do you talk to? Who are you supposed to engage with? Like who is the law enforcement have a duty to, or the prosecutor have a duty to talk to about every single issue? How do we change our legal structure and our legal system so that these big entities that have dispersed and decentralized owners who might disagree with each other on what the best step forward is, who is the decision maker here and how does law enforcement help? And then another issue on top of it, and I'm hoping this part will be fixed in the future, but some of these hacks like aren't technically illegal, right? So, I mean, Matt Levine did a really interesting, everything Matt Levine does is the most interesting thing I've read, but he, just sort of was talking about the Beanstalk hack, you could call, or attack. And think about like a flash loan exploit or a governance takeover. If you truly believe code is law, under the circumstances, is this illegal? Is it something that we should want to be illegal? In the traditional financial system, it would be, but at the end of the day, until there's more regulation and guardrails, in DeFi, you're sort of your own bank, which means that you have to deal with your own bank robbers. So we can rely on law enforcement to a certain amount, but there going to be a lot of hurdles along the way.
Yeah, that's a deep philosophical question. I mean, if there's a bug in the code and it's exploited, is that really a hack or not? I mean, it's your code after all.
Right.
But okay, so maybe that's a hard question. Maybe we will leave that question for another day. But
I love everything on this panel.
well, yeah. But Ari, I also want to kind of turn to you. You probably have a lot. You at TRM, you see a lot of these hacks happening, and you see how the victims, the companies that were affected, how they react and how they involve law enforcement. So Jesse gave a really good overview of the challenges. Maybe could you say a little bit more tactically, like how do you see the interaction with law enforcement actually working?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And look, I mean, I'm sure what's come out of this entire couple of days, right, is that there's a spectrum of what decentralized finance is and what DAOs are. I think the Financial Action Task Force, which is sort of the UN of money laundering, in some latest guidance, tried to sort of address the issue of DeFi and talks a lot about sort of, is this just sort of what Dan described, and that is sort of code that's, a smart contract that's sent out onto a blockchain, or is it something different? Does it feel sort of more like something centralized where you have an owner operator, where you have someone engaging with users? So there's probably a spectrum of different ways that DeFi interact with law enforcement and regulators. There are, we have a number of clients in the DeFi space, many actually, and when something like this happens, obviously we would get involved and have connections to law enforcement and would sort of work through those channels. And then we would work to the extent possible to track and trace the flow of those funds. I think that this sort of idea that a true decentralized protocol or true decentralized autonomous organization, that becomes much more complicated. If there are not, when there's a general counsel, when there are, there's a CEO, there are people you sort of work through. When that doesn't exist, it becomes sort of a lot more complicated. But there's no question when you're talking about something like, the Ronin hack. I think that was first, investigated as one of these sort of large multi-million-dollar hacks. It turned into a major national security investigation involving, the National Security Council and the White House and the FBI and others, when you find out that, a dangerous nation state actor is involved in the attack. So I think there's I think to Jesse's point, and Dan sort of laughed, I mean, it's like, there are so many complex questions in this space. And I think, but a lot of them maybe come down to sort of, definitions and what is the entity how does the entity actually operate despite sort of what it is called?
Yeah, no, that's really good point. The Ronin hack, by the way, is really quite remarkable. If the source really is, that North Korea, it's a significant chunk of their GDP actually, what was stolen. So this is a lot of pretty significant impact.
Years ago, North Korea, as an early adopter of this sort of thing, realized that they were one of the few places on Earth that was truly cut off from the global financial system. And really professionalized state-sponsored hacking. And they see cryptocurrency exchanges as great targets, everything from small startups to sort of larger exchanges. And yeah, I mean, it's essentially a banana republic from a economic standpoint that plays on the same digital battlefield as the United States and China and Russia and others because of this cyber capability. And yeah, it's really extraordinary. And to me, when you look at so many of these attacks, all roads lead to North Korea. One sort of important factor, though, to understand is that so many of these hacks, the vast majority occur because of social engineering. These types of actors are going after specific individuals who hold the private keys or who can gain access, who, if you put malware on their computer, can help you gain access to the exchange, to the funds. And, this is really sort of not a DeFi or a crypto issue in many respects. It's a cyber issue. And the real key here, and I know this is maybe for later in the conversation, but the real key here is for these businesses, even these nascent businesses, right, early stage startups, to really, fortify and harden their cyber defenses, because that's the way these bad actors are gaining access to their platforms. Crypto is the target. It's not sort of the cause of any of these types of hacks.
Yeah. And each one of these companies really is kind of on the front lines in this battle.
Absolutely. Really well said.
Yeah. So this actually leads us right into the next topic that I wanted to talk about, which is basically how to mitigate the risks of future attacks on DAOs and blockchain applications in general. So Dan Guido, maybe you can talk us through the role of security audits. Maybe you could talk a little bit about what Trail of Bits does. And so on. So what is the best way to defend against these attacks or future attacks?
Yeah, so I'd love to dig into a little bit of the finer questions that we discussed earlier too. So, yeah, if we step back and look at what's the role of the company after the hack is performed, I think that a lot of people think about this in the traditional sense that, we should have monitoring. We should build security monitoring because then we'll know about the attack and we can do something to stop it. But especially for these attacks that occur on the blockchain, they occur in a single transaction. They are bundled up to take place with a level of immediacy that is unheard of when you consider it against sort of more traditional sort of network penetration, like what happened with Axie. So the role of security monitoring really completely shifts, and it's no longer a security benefit. It's only a reliability sort of consistency check. It's a performance issue. It's not a security one. So a lot of the concern that people have to address for these issues is more building yourself the capability to respond in the first place. And that comes from a product architectural standpoint. So a lot of DAOs that we see are usually built because they're trying to perform governance on top of a complicated blockchain protocol. And what a lot of them do for aligning themselves with the ethos of the blockchain is they put in a time lock where any kind of change to the feature set of the protocol is delayed by a certain number of days, therefore allowing a lot of people in the DAO to vote on that feature, to be well informed about what it is. But as a consequence, what that does is it ties it ties both hands behind your back, because now if you have a product security issue and somebody has hacked your smart contract, you are unable to respond unless you wait for that time frame. And let's say that you received an external report. Like, let's say that you found an issue in your product that no one has exploited yet because a friendly person reported it to you. Now you have to make public the fact that you're changing the entire system and hope that it escapes notice by anybody for a period of 3 days or 7 days or possibly longer. So that actually invites attacks. So there's a lot of kind of questions here and operations here that are much different than regular software. And again, a lot of people do not understand the problem that they are solving when they're building these systems, and they walk blindly into security issues because they haven't done like a tabletop exercise. They haven't thought out like, well, what happens if our contract does get hacked? So from a product design standpoint, a lot of people race towards this full decentralization where everything is mediated via the blockchain, and they don't reserve enough centralized capabilities for themselves. So that's one big issue that people are screwing up. Now, when it comes to these kind of private key related attacks, where somebody has gained access to the corporate network of someone behind the operation of a blockchain. Now, that is targeting those capabilities that you held back, those centralized methods that you can still kind of manipulate state or roll back state or pause the contract or perform some other kind of response. That requires that you maintain some kind of key that now you have to ultimately protect, because if you lose control of it, somebody else can do all that stuff. So this is definitely a give and take sort of situation where there's a balance that you have to strike. And it is a very difficult balance to strike. Now, those public key disclosures that result in raiding somebody's treasury, the real issue here is, again, like there's corporate IT security. There's like, well, everybody needs to have EDR on all of their endpoint devices. Their Mac needs to run antivirus, right? Like whatever. But the real issue here is that the firms that are operating these blockchain products, they do not understand the situation that they're entering into, the threat environment that they're walking into. They need to segregate access to those keys. They need to put them inside of something like an HSM that is separate from their entire network, so that the effect of a hack is meaningless. That if somebody anywhere across the company has their computer compromised, that there's no way that they can jump from that computer to owning access to a private key that centrally controls some important aspect of the blockchain system. A lot of people discover that far, far too late, and they leave those private keys on a developer machine so that developer can have immediate access to the blockchain system, or they don't distribute ownership of it, where it's only a single compromise that allows them access to that key. And what I'm talking about there is more like the, what do you call it? The 4 eyes principle, that there needs to be 2 people involved in every sort of sensitive action that takes place against these systems, that you need to have multiple people compromised before you start to have those privileges.
But Dan, actually, I want to focus your answer just a little bit in that.
Yeah, sorry.
In fact, I think it is important to explain what Trail of Bits does.
Yes.
Because I think it is a valuable service in the space. So maybe you could just say a few words about what you're providing.
Totally. Sorry, sorry for the tangent. Felt it was important to say that.
Sure.
So Trail of Bits is a service provider that people hire to help identify and reduce weaknesses in their products. We end up working closely with software development teams and help them understand what are they building, write down a specification for it, and then test against that. We also help address more architectural risks, things that only humans can really understand. So we will apply all kinds of best practices and drive the level of maturity of your software development team towards that of verified code, where the code only does the things that it's supposed to do and it's resistant to things that are not that. Now, the odd part about this is that, before I get into that, so a lot of these projects, they end up being quite short, but they're high intensity. We'll usually come in and inspect a design document and provide feedback on it before any code is written. And then we might come back later and stay there for about a month to do what I would call an implementation review. So after the product is functional and you can perform some actions with it, then our engineers would review the source code for it and identify those weaknesses, and then probably write tests that help prove that it does the right thing. And then finally, before you actually go out to deployment, we also might do a pre-deployment review, where you want to ensure that you actually address all the issues that were raised earlier in the development lifecycle. We find that about 50% of the security issues that are identified earlier are not remediated correctly by the software development team without review from someone like Trail of Bits. Usually they mitigate an effect of the issue, but they don't actually address the root cause. Or sometimes it's just a broken fix, like a developer had the best of intentions, but they're not a security expert, and it happens. Now, a lot of this is driven by consulting teams, by outside vendors, because there is not a lot of expertise among security engineers for how to apply these techniques. There is an extraordinary talent shortage, which means that a lot of the teams that we work with do not have the sophistication internally to make these changes and understand these risks themselves. It is only a process that has just begun for some of these blockchain protocols to hire an internal security team, to get one person. They are lucky, very, very lucky, if they have one person on staff that knows anything about what the services that Trail of Bits offers.
Actually, I want to add there that there's really kind of, so really what you're describing is a security audit that's done maybe at the design phase and also very importantly before the launch actually happens. And I think it is important to stress that there's now a litany of common vulnerabilities in Solidity and other projects that not all developers are aware of, and they end up making the same mistakes that other projects do, and a service like Trail of Bits basically points that out and makes sure that the code is at least up to security standards when it's deployed. I do want to mention, just for completeness, would you mind talking about other services in the space, things like Sartora and other companies that play in the space?
Absolutely. So if you actually reach the level of maturity where you have staff internally that understand some of these techniques, where you have a security engineer, you have somebody that's done software verification or rigorous sorts of testing, then there are a wealth of service providers that actually are available to you. And one of them that you mentioned is Sartora, which is quite a good company, if I do say so myself. But what they offer is a point solution. So it requires kind of a sophisticated consumer internally. If you have that, then what Sartora can do, and there are other tools for it as well. We have one called Echidna, and there's just a bunch of kind of the general class of security testing tools. Essentially, it's property testing. It allows you to specify, hey, here's what I think this contract does. This is what I intended to do. And you can express that. And then what a tool like Sartora can do is it will evaluate all these potential cases of what the contract could actually do and see if it matches up. If it ever deviates from that specification, then it rings all kinds of alarm bells. And it tells you that, hey, there's something here that your contract is capable of doing, and that might be a hack. You probably should address that.
So that's perfect. So what I want our audience to take away from this is there's a whole litany of tools that will help you write secure code and make sure that at least you're not making the mistakes that we've already learned about in the past, and your code is up to standard. So before deploying, you have to know about all these tools and take advantage of what they provide. So that's one approach to mitigate the security risk of hacks. Another approach is what people do in the Web 2 world, which is they provide bug bounties, right? So if somebody finds a vulnerability, there's a bug bounty that's paid out, and that encourages people to report the vulnerabilities rather than exploit it. So Jesse, I wanted to kind of turn it to you and ask you, what is your opinion of bug bounties in the Web3 space, or in DAOs in particular?
Sure. So there's definitely not a one size fits all here, and there's a variety of these programs, not all created equal, but I really think that there's something to be said about leveraging the hive mind here. And if you really believe that everything should be decentralized or be towards the path of decentralization, maybe security of a DAO should also be a part of that. And it doesn't take place of the amazing work that Trail of Bits does, or Gauntlet, or a variety of other platforms, but the compostable nature of this technology allows for regular people to be a part of the solution. And as I said before, regular people are in this space, putting their money in this space, and they are trying to trust this space. And sometimes, it's not working out for them. And so maybe they can be part of the solution too, and, part of the security side of the solution too. Now, so Obviously, I recognize that there's a Cobra effect here, and there's definitely an example or two of bugs being created so that people can get bug bounties from it. But it's definitely not a long-term solution, but through vetting and responsible disclosures, I think that there's really value here. And you're seeing a lot of platforms start to create these and then also work with centralized third parties to help vet the individuals that would be part of the bug bounty.
Yeah, and there are even services out there that will crowdsource this bug bounty.
Right.
I don't think we
Yeah,
don't.
I mean, it goes without saying. I mean, but it's almost like it's so extraordinary to watch what happens when one of these hacks occurs, because like in the cases Jesse and I used to work in, money laundering cases, it was bulk cash smuggling and networks of hawalas and shell companies and all this stuff that people like, yes, prosecutors, investigators, agents were looking at these things. But when a hack occurs today, the world is watching. I mean, crypto Twitter goes insane. Sort of, with to Jesse's point, sort of real people watching this in real time. And there is this sort of self-policing that you see occurring. I think the Poly network hack is a great example where you saw, the world watching. You ultimately saw someone come out a couple of days later and say they were a white hat attacker. As a prosecutor, I am skeptical of those sorts of things. So I immediately thought to myself, well, either this is a white hat attacker or it's someone who couldn't off ramp hundreds of millions of dollars in cryptocurrency and decided to figure out some other way to mitigate that situation. But regardless, and this sort of crowdsourcing, this allows investigations to occur by really anybody, and I think it's very powerful because what it really says is like there's a world in which this space can self-police itself, at least to some extent. Which I think takes some of the pressure potentially off of law enforcement, which cannot, just doesn't have the resources to react to every hack.
So actually, Ari, I'm glad you brought that up, because the third tool, I guess we talked about securing your code. We talked about bug bounties to help you find vulnerabilities in your code. And the third tool in the arsenal is potentially buy insurance that will insure you against hacks. So,
yeah. I'll let Jesse take the insurance question.
Oh,
but,
okay.
Yeah. But I would just say to all of this to some extent, like I do really believe that it comes down to hardening your cyber defenses against these types of attacks to begin with. And I think, look, to Dan's point, that becomes either a software, a programming question, okay, or if it's a more centralized exchange, it really becomes sort of a cybersecurity question. To on education, on sort of stopping bad actors from breaching your exchange, stealing funds. So and I think so my first reaction is there are ways to stop these things from happening, but it does start with hardening cybersecurity. And I think one of the reasons these types of businesses are so vulnerable to these attacks is I think it was something Dan described earlier, that like we're all building the plane while we're flying it. And that's just the nature of this space. I mean, it's a space filled with even the largest companies are startups, and it's a very nascent industry. And you're thinking about building a company, you're not necessarily always thinking about baking in cyber defenses. And I think that's really why these companies to some extent are vulnerable, and what is really just needs to be a focus.
I have to say, in our blockchain courses, we spend quite a lot of time on how to build secure solidity contracts and Web3 APIs and such. So thanks for bringing that up. But I do want to mention that I do want us to discuss the third component in the defense, right? So we talked about hardening your code, we talked about bug bounties and insurance. I just wanted to get a sense of how useful you think insurance is in the space. So Jesse, do you want to take that on?
Well,
yeah.
Sorry, I just want to say one thing about bug bounties before we move.
Sure.
1 minute.
Let's do it.
So bug bounties kind of imply that there's this there are ways to think about bug bounties that are good and ways that are bad, right? A bug bounty is not a security control. It does not prevent your code from getting hacked. You have to actually invest in the product security and like do things that produce secure code. A bug bounty is a lot more similar to insurance that we're talking about now. It is this pile of money that you put out there and you hope that people are incentivized to report things to you. It's more about community engagement. It is a community engagement strategy, not exactly a security strategy. The other thing that's important here is that, again, it like implies that there's this crowd that has wisdom that are out there that could help you. But as I mentioned before, because of this extreme talent shortage, there really isn't a crowd the crowd of people that are doing bug bounty stuff for blockchain software is a group of like 5 to 10 people. So your community engagement strategy needs to reflect that. It's really about getting one of these kind of super producers of bugs, some extraordinarily effective security engineer, to collaborate with you on your project. It's not about just like openly engaging with anybody and everybody. And that won't result in you actually getting any value from running the bug bounty. So again, bug bounty is kind of a last step after you've already done all this investment that proves to you, that provides some assurance to you that your code is safe. Okay, now let's talk about insurance.
Great, makes sense. So, but yeah, I do want to address the insurance question. So, Jesse,
well, I think for all of this conversation, the first principle is you need to build it well at the start, and you need to have good code, and you need to focus on that as your number one. Bug bounties, insurance, et cetera, are putting band-aids on it and things that we should consider if it's right for your protocol and it will work and make you feel more secure. I mean, and I think bug bounties and insurance are similar in some ways, but also different in other ways. I think the insurance debate, you can say, well, why not? It sort of is another check and it'll protect me. And you can also say maybe it's a waste of money. But I think the discussion around insurance as it relates to ransomware and ransomware attacks is one that also sort of works in this space. So for anyone that was sort of following, about a year ago, the number of ransomware attacks was sort of headlines like the ones we're seeing right now with DeFi attacks. It was just one after the other and all over the news, and obviously big national security implications stemming from that. But as part of that big debate was, should we allow people to provide ransomware insurance? And the reason for saying maybe not is that it ends up creating a target for yourself. And what we were seeing as you look deeper into who had ransomware insurance and what it looked like was that, you know, ransomware insurance, if you had a $10 million sort of payout policy, the ransomware attackers were asking just for that. Like all the information was getting leaked. It was very easy to see. The same sort of applies here. If you think about getting insurance for your platform, does that make you a bigger target because they know that you'll be able to pay out and if they don't get access to it? So you can think about it that way. But there's also developing insurance in this space for individuals and institutions that are putting money into DeFi. And I think that's sort of an interesting, different type of insurance. And insurance is taking a variety of different forms. So there's typical insurance that you get the payout, like we all know it, but there's also these new technological solutions, which maybe aren't using the word insurance, but they're providing a form of insurance for you to protect the funds that you put into the system. And that's what I really get excited about in this space, is that the leveraging of the technology in order to make solutions that make the space more private, more secure, and protect investors on an individual level. So there's just one company that we are investing in. They're still very new, but just disclosure, Ribbit's investing in it. They're called Redefine. And they are trying to facilitate institutions investing into DeFi. And, you know, they provide sort of risk scoring, like I think TRM does something like that as well. And they help you decide which ones have, which platforms are the safest, but they also help you see if a hack is coming. So what they'll do is, based on their constant visibility and the transparency of different platforms in DeFi, they're able to see the activity. And if they see something that's a high risk, they'll be able to alert their clients, their institutional clients, and say, hey, we need to get your money out of there. Or do you give us permission to go in and they use some technology to wrap your money so that you are not part of that hack. So I think if we think about traditional insurance in the way that we all know it, and we've, grown up in the Web 1, Web 2 world, then, it's a different discussion. But I think if you think of it as there's these amazing new technologies and brains developing these compliant solutions that look like insurance, but look a little bit different as well. I think those are the tools that are going to be really exciting here.
Yeah, actually, there is a question in the chat about which insurance providers, which insurance services you suggest. So thanks for mentioning that one. If there's others you're excited about, feel free to share that as well. So actually, we're coming close to the end, and if anybody has any questions that they want to ask in the Q&A, please use the Q&A tool, and we'll be happy to discuss your questions. But before we open it up to the questions from the audience, I kind of want to get kind of a last statement from the three of you about your prediction for the future. So what do you think is going to happen? Are we going to get this hack problem under control? Or is this just going to continue the way it is, and this is going to be the cost of doing business on chain? Which way is it going to go? Dan, do you wanna start?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think I kind of gave away my answer when we first began. I think that the industry has really bifurcated into security haves and have-nots. Or how I've heard other people describe it is that there are lots of people that are below the security poverty line. So there are a lot of people that are not investing in the sorts of things that they need, or they're incapable of finding the resources to, because they didn't work with a smart contract security firm like Trail of Bits early enough, or they didn't hire internal staff to secure themselves. So we're going to continue seeing those firms getting hacked. A lot of these like new technologies for active response, like Jesse was talking about, in cases of hacks, they're not tested. They may work, they may not. And it's kind of like a open question as to the efficacy of a lot of different tools and products and services that are out there to handle these sorts of issues after they occur. So really, in my mind, all the weight is still on the upfront development of secure software. And there are just not a lot of firms that are prepared to tackle that challenge. So I definitely see that there is going to continue to be this bimodal distribution. So I would not be surprised that the news stories do not end. But what you need to remember is that there are some firms that are not going to be represented in that news cycle. And those firms are the ones who will have invested in these sorts of things and can actually evade the attacks that are occurring.
See, if only we could write news articles that say these 5 firms were not hacked today. And that would be like a news title. That would be great. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Where do you think things are going to go?
You know, honestly, similarly, although I would say, look, I think it's going to get worse before it gets better sort of situation. You know, you're still in this very early days, sort of pre-first inning, you know, as companies are building in this space. And again, you know, for a startup, you know, I think to Dan's point, cybersecurity may not be, you know, the thing that they're spending sort of the time on, even though a hack could essentially mean the end of your entity, end of your business. So I think we're going to see more, but I really do strongly believe that sort of as the space matures, and this might not be the most popular piece here, I think there's going to be more regulation coming. But I think you're also going to see sort of this space mature, build out cyber controls, and it's going to become more of a focus. But I think that is going to take time. And we are in the very, very early days. You know, people don't remember what the early days of the internet looked like. And that's where we are today in this space. And it's going to take some time. But I do believe the space will mature to a place where there's not an everyday news story of hundreds of millions of dollars being lost in a hack.
Yeah, and whenever somebody brings up regulation, I always wonder, regulation by which government?
Yeah.
It's not even clear.
By many governments. Yeah.
The global service. Yeah, Jesse, what's your outlook? What do you think things will look like in the coming years?
Sure, I'm hopeful, but if you know me, I'm always hopeful. You know, I just feel like I was lucky enough to be on both sides of the government, and you know, I've just been watching the government really learn and get smart in this space and support like new and innovative solutions. Like, look at what the Biden EO, that today California came out with their blockchain executive order. There's just really openness to new techniques and ways to regulate. And you know, as a former regulator, you know, I think that we could use a little bit more of that in this space, although obviously that might be unpopular for some. But also I've been lucky enough to be at a company in the private sector where I get to meet really smart people building in this space and thinking about how to make it safer and private for individuals, and sort of the best space that it can be. And like, just stepping back, you know, we see the news stories, the news likes to talk about the worst things that are happening. But if you look at what's happening in traditional finance when it comes to money laundering, which has been around a lot longer, the numbers are way more staggering. Like the percentage of a bad activity and laundering within DeFi is minimal compared to that in traditional finance. That doesn't mean it's not an issue, but you know, I think someone mentioned in the chat, maybe it was in the last one, about the Swift hack, but Swift itself said that it's relatively minimal how much is going on in crypto compared to what they see. So I think that things are definitely going to get better in the DeFi space, but we can't kid ourselves that we're going to be able to get rid of this problem. Like no financial institution is able to. It's just trying to be smart about it. And, you know, as Trail of Bits Dan said, a lot of the vulnerabilities here are the same as those that existed in traditional finance. And it's something that people have been trying to tackle for a long time. And sometimes it's just people that click on the wrong link in their email versus people that disclose their private key that has access to a treasury. So, you know, some of these problems are not going away. It's just a matter of how do we protect ourselves.
Yeah, but it does also hurt the reputation of the space in the public's eye. The fact that there are constant news articles about all these attacks. I mean, to Dan Gita's point, it would be nice if there were some articles saying, you know, these firms were never hacked, and but that's not a headline.
Well, so I actually love this. One of the really unique considerations about the blockchain space is that you can't hide when you've been hacked. Like, how many firms out there have been hacked and they just hire an incident response firm and cover up the whole thing? And there's not even like uniform breach notification laws across the United States or across the world. So you just might not know. Whereas when a hack occurs on the blockchain, all of you are familiar with all the, you know, TRM labs or whatever, they see it and it shows up on Twitter 5 minutes later. A lot of times it's people on Twitter that notice it first. It's just so inverted from what normal software is like. So I think that's actually great because it's helping advance the life cycle of how we learn from these attacks, where that does not occur. You know, we want to have like when an airplane crashes or whatever, it's the same deal, right? Like now we have the ability to do something like that on blockchain software because all these attacks are so public.
Yeah, so every time a hack happens, actually the entire industry learns and gets better as a result. So that's kind of a positive, the positive aspect of this transparency. Yeah, so this has been great. I mean, there are not too many questions in the chat, which is fine. Although I can see that the live chat was quite active, which is great. So yeah, so I think this is a good point for us to end on a positive note. So thank you all so much for coming, and thank you all for all the audience and everyone in the audience who stayed with us for the 3-day event. It's been a fantastic event. I really enjoyed it. Yeah, Kristen, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you to both Dan's, Jesse, and Ari for sharing their thoughts on DAO security vulnerabilities and ways to mitigate the risk of an attack. This concludes the Stanford DAO Symposium. I want to thank you all for joining us, and thanks to all of the speakers for sharing their knowledge with us over these past few days. Please do fill out an evaluation form if you haven't already, and look for an email in the next few weeks with a link to the program recordings. Also keep in touch. Let us know how we can continue to advance the conversation around governance in this new world of Web3. So thank you, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your week.
Yeah, thanks all. Goodbye.
Everyone, thank you.